The next question comes from Matt Bergeron, who says, I recently started playing the song Rio by Duran Duran. I list the chord changes for the intro, and he says, my question is, what is the science or theory behind why that A chord sounds so weird in there? It sounds great, it just sounds different than a normal A chord when in this progression. Now, this is a great question, and what this addresses is the twofold aspect of studying harmony as a guitar player. Harmony exists vertically in the context of what I call the chord of the moment. All right, if I just play an A major chord and nothing else, I'm only experiencing the personality of those notes vertically. I'm hearing the unique sound of that voicing. A lot of times in classical music, you hear this called sonority. Sonority is kind of the characteristics of a vertical stack of notes. Now, when you hear an A major, you hear, and this is the nature of major chords in general, you hear a bright sound, okay? That's vertical harmony. Horizontal harmony is the relationship from one chord to the next. And what you're really asking about with this question is, why does this A chord feel the way it does in relation to the other chords? What we're really talking about here when we dissect chord progressions is how chords relate in the circle of keys. You might have heard this called the cycle of keys, or the circle of fifths, cycle of fifths, cycle of fourths. There's all kinds of different names for it. The basic idea is to arrange chord relationships based on how they interact with each other. If you start on the note C and you go clockwise in the circle of keys, also called the circle of fifths, we have these neighboring relationships between various types of chords. You can also go backwards in the circle of keys, often called the cycle of fourths or the circle of fourths, and you get other types of chord relationships. You put this all together and you essentially get this giant circle of chord relationships. I like to think of the circle of keys as exactly that. It's the circle of close to distant relationships. When you arrange chords in a progression, it's not just the personality of the vertical chords, it's how they relate to each other. So when you put all of this stuff together, okay, if you take, starting with the circle of keys using major chords, I've written in every triad note for every one of these chords in the circle of keys as far as majors. You can also fill the circle of keys with minor chords, okay? So we get all 12 major keys and all 12 minor keys in one giant circle which has every chord relationship in it. Here's the first important thing. There are actually 12 different circles of keys because any chord can sit at top. Any chord can sit at home. Okay, if we were looking at the chord progression you gave me, what is the starting point of that chord progression for Rio by Duran Duran? It's an E minor chord. The second I hear a song with an E minor chord, I am expecting to hear all of these other closely related chords. And the reason why the circle of keys is so powerful is that it allows you to almost predict what's going to happen in a song if you know relationships between chords. When I hear an E minor chord, I'm expecting this song, if it's based around an E minor tonality, if that's home, if that's the key center of the song, I'm expecting a song that has an E minor chord in it to probably also have a G chord or a C chord or an A minor chord or a D chord or a B minor chord. All of these chords work really well together. And the reason for that relationship is that there are notes in common from one chord to the next. As a matter of fact, to really help you visualize this, take a look at this on the piano. If I play an E minor triad, a basic E minor chord, which has the notes E, G, and B. If I follow this E minor chord with a C major chord, which has the notes C, E, and G, notice that E minor to C major shares these two notes. These two notes are in both chords. So why does E minor to C major sound so pleasing? Because 2/3 of the chord is the same notes. If I was a vocalist and I sang E, okay, over both chords, it's a common tone. Okay, what if I have G? So, the more common notes there are between chords, the more related they feel. Where things get interesting, and this is kind of what you were asking about, is when a chord deviates from that, okay? These are the most expected chords that I'm going to encounter if I start on an E minor. But what about all these other chords, okay? Look at where the A major chord is that you mentioned. And you're like, why does that A chord feel so different? All right. The main reason that A chord feels different is that it is further away from our level of expectation than what we normally encounter in an E minor key signature. Not only are we hearing this bright A major, which once again, vertically A major is a happy sound. It's not only a happy sound, but it's a little more distant from home than we expect. When it comes to hearing and experiencing a chord progression, your ear has a memory of the previous chord that it just heard, and it will hear the new chord in relation to the sound of that previous chord. So we have vertical personality, which is the chord of the moment, but then we have horizontal personality, which is the relationships between different chords. I'm going to address this a little bit further in another question that was asked by somebody else this week, but here's an amazing thing about the circle of keys. Whatever your key center is, in this case, if you're starting on E minor, that's home. That's where things feel the best. When you go next door, one step in either direction in the circle of keys, that still feels really good. So if I'm in the key of G major or in the key of E minor, you could think of these as being the same key. You often hear this called relative keys. The analogy I make is, if I play a G major to an E minor, I haven't actually really left home because both of these chords live in the same slice of the circle of keys. Think of it as G major is you're in the kitchen and E minor is you go downstairs to the basement. Okay, you haven't actually left home when you play those two chords. But what if you go to your neighbor's house? You go from a G chord to a D chord. That's right down the street. Okay, that's a nice relationship. Well, what is a G chord to a D flat chord? Here's the amazing thing about a chord change like that. If I just play a D flat major with nothing else, what do you think about that chord? Feels nice, right? Feels pretty because vertically it's major. But what happens when I play that D flat after a G? Isn't this major? Okay, in other words, a major chord followed by a major chord is not always what you think it is. Okay, here's a major followed by a major. That's beautiful. Here's major followed by major. Also beautiful. Here's major followed by major. Why does that feel so weird? I thought major chords were always super happy. The reason why that feels so weird is because of how far apart that relationship is. So when you hear that A chord in the Duran Duran tune, you're not only hearing it vertically as an A major that is happy, but you are actually hearing it on the brighter side of the circle of keys. Let me zoom out a little bit on this diagram here, okay? Chords that live in a close relationship in the circle of keys feel really good. Chords that go further to the counterclockwise side of the circle of keys get darker. And that doesn't matter if it's major or minor. And chords on the other side of the circle of keys get brighter or more uplifting. And that doesn't matter if it's major or minor. I had a songwriting student years ago who was playing me some of his original music. And I said, you need to darken up your songs with more major chords. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He was like, darken the song with majors? I thought majors were bright and happy and uplifting. Yeah, but what happens when those majors are really far from home? What if I'm in the key of G and I play nice, friendly relationships in the key of G, and then I play this, which is far from home? Okay, I can actually create a darker emotion with a major chord. I can also create a brighter emotion with a minor chord. So learn your circle of keys. If you learn the relationships between chords and how they connect to each other, you will find that this really unlocks why progressions resonate the way that they do with us. It's not just understanding that a single chord voicing has a personality, but this chord voicing, whatever I play after this, is going to have some kind of relationship to where this chord is in the circle of keys. And it might be really close, or what does that feel like? That's two major chords back to back. So don't confuse major and minor as always being bright and dark. The circle of keys will map out your relationships between all of those chord movements.